Hey folks, welcome back to my channel. My name is Akshay SA, and in this series of videos I will be explaining and implementing the crucial Terraform concepts in a managed Kubernetes service known as AWS EKS. This is going to be purely on Kubernetes implementations using Terraform on AWS EKS environment. Before we get started, I strongly recommend you folks to check a link in the description which talks about it's a video which talks about the Kubernetes fundamentals. If you're not sure about if you're not sure or if you're not learned about the Kubernetes fundamentals, I strongly recommend you go through that video first. It's somewhere close to 2.5 hours. It's very good, so please go through that first. Then let's go on. You can keep following up with the later videos. So the first topic I will be explaining about the AWS VPC. So if you'd like to deploy any cloud infrastructure, the first thing which you're supposed to have in place is the virtual private cloud, which involves all the networking aspects where the services will be deployed. So the first I'll be explaining the concepts of VPC and then how the VPC can be deployed and automated using the Terraform scripts. Later on in that VPC, in that public subnet, I will be deploying an EC2 Bastion host. The purpose of Bastion host is to SSH into the other computing services which are in the private subnets, so that we can make changes to those computing services. Since they are not available publicly, we'll SSH into those compute instance via the Bastion host. After that, I will be explaining about a EKS cluster setup, which talks about both public and private node groups. The purpose of this particular section is to give an overview and a proper understanding, a basic understanding of how EKS clusters actually work. So after this, I will be explaining about the Kubernetes fundamentals. So in the Kubernetes fundamentals, I will be explaining the most important Kubernetes objects like pods, replica sets, deployments, services, and so on. And after that, going to the next one, I will be explaining about the Kubernetes deployments and services using Terraform K8 providers. Later on, I will also be explaining about the Terraform remote state storage. The purpose of this topic is to explain why the Terraform state file needs to be stored in a centralized storage like an EBS, for example. And the purpose is because there will be many SRE engineers and DevOps engineers who will be monitoring and making changes to the EKS clusters or any cloud services for that matter. If they're using Terraform, it is most advisable and practical to store the Terraform state file in a remote state storage. So going to the next one, we have the topic of IAM roles and Kubernetes service accounts. So these two are part of IRSA, and the purpose of IRSA along with EKS IAM is to enhance the security aspects of the Kubernetes clusters. Then we have the two topics, the EBS and EFS CSI for the Kubernetes storage. Any Kubernetes storage will require a certain form of Any Kubernetes clusters will have certain form of storage to store all the cluster data. So that will be provided in the form of AWS EBS, block storage, and AWS EFS, which is the file storage. And those services can be integrated to the EKS clusters using a CSI, which is Container Service Integrations. So once that is done, I will be explaining one of the biggest topics, which is the ingress. So I'll talk about the ingress in depth later. After that, I will also be discussing about the IAM and one of the most crucial topics of the EKS cluster, which is the Fargate. In the real-time scenarios, in most of the real-time scenarios, much of the application workload in the Kubernetes in the EKS clusters are run on the serverless architecture known as EKS Fargate. So I'll be discussing that as well. And after that, I'll also be explaining about the horizontal port scaling and the vertical port scaling. So coming to the last topic, I'll be explaining about the EKS monitoring and logging with the help of AWS CloudWatch and FluentBit. If possible, on the later videos, I will also be implementing and explaining about Prometheus with Grafana for EKS clusters as well. So I'll try to make that possible. But apart from that, so these are the topics which I'll be covering in this series of videos. And again, before you start off with this series of videos, I strongly recommend to go through the Terraform Fundamentals, and the link is in the description. Make sure you check it out. And after that, hop on to the next video, where I'll be explaining about the AWS VPC, which is of a 3-tier network. Okay, so let's get started.